Our next speaker is Anukriti Hittal. She goes by Anu. A couple things about Anu is she's currently a scholar at the East-West Center. She's been active observer at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change at Paris, Bonn, and Lima. She teaches environmental studies and is intensely interested in issues of climate change. She also has a weekly show on Think Tech that people should tune into. She's going to talk to you about COP21, Paris Agreement. We think it's critical that she explain the details of this event, helps us understand what the world is doing to address the issues related to climate change. So, without further ado, we have Anu.
Aloha kako. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here, and I'm not really sure why I'm here amongst such giants, but I will attempt to enlighten you a little bit about the COP21. At least that's my job, supposedly. Okay, so I'll try to do all of that in less than 7 minutes. A process that started in 1992. Okay, so since all things are related, and that's the theme of this workshop, let me take you back to the global level and how that ties, how your efforts here tie into that global conversation that's been going on. This is, of course, when the Paris Agreement was signed, this is what bureaucrats look like when they party. So, So the global negotiations are really, it's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and we fondly call that the UNFCCC in an attempt to shorten that. It has 196 parties, that means signatories, and of those 195 are countries, and one is the European Union, which comprises 28 nations. And the COP21, the COP, is the Conference of the Parties, which is, they party, every year in a different international location. And this was the 21st such meeting. So these COPs take place every year. And this was the 21st one in Paris. You folks would have heard about that and followed that, perhaps. So, I led a delegation of students from Washington University in St. Louis, which is my home institution, and we were research and independent NGOs, so we were called RINGOs, and we were observers under the United Nations Framework Convention. So the main outcomes are really, there are several outcomes. Some of them are kind of more boring than others, but I just thought I would highlight these ones that are most relevant. Of course, Dr. Fletcher talked about this already, this is really the first time that nations have come together to really try and get that goal of under 2-degree warming, to keep that under 2-degree warming, 2 degrees Celsius. And 1.5 degrees is really what island states have been pushing for, because they've said that 2-degree warming will just lead to a lot more sea level rise and climate changes and so on, that it really may present an existential threat to some of these islands. And so, led by the Marshall Islands, there was a group of folks that pushed, negotiators that pushed for the 1.5, and that is mentioned in the document. But it's only mentioned. It's not really anything that countries are necessarily working towards. So the other thing that was really, people ask me, is this enforceable? Well, this was the first time that they really had put together a very significant component of monitoring what countries have pledged. So not only is this the first time that countries have come together to say they will work towards it, how will they work towards it? And that is through these pledges, which are called nationally determined contributions. You may have heard that sort of roaming around. There's an acronym for that, but basically I'll just call them pledges. And so those pledges will be monitored, they will be reported, and they will be verified by the international community. So that really is the enforcement mechanism, that you will be accountable to your peers in an international forum. This will not be done quietly somewhere, but out loud, and everyone will get to see what you are and are not doing. Okay, so there will be a global stock take in 2023, and then every 5 years after that. And the transparency and the review process in this it's quite different from what other COPs have done before. Okay, and then the last big outcome, I would say, is that they really have taken the Green Climate Fund, which is funding for climate-based projects, starting at a baseline of $100 billion. And that's not the first time that they've talked about it, but it really did go operational in November. They started to accept proposals and so on. But they're also, so this time they decided that the $100 billion was going to be a baseline, not that that was going to be the ambition. So those were the main outcomes, I would say. The small island states actually had some influence in all of these negotiations. Aside from that 1.5 degrees that I mentioned, they also helped to simplify the channels of funding from this GCF, or the Green Climate Fund. So unfortunately, Hawaii doesn't really fit into that because it's part of the United States, but for other island nations and our neighboring countries here in the Pacific, this is significant. Also, there is a strengthened mechanism for loss and damage, which is what happens when you face climate-related events. And there was no money actually associated with that, because anything with money in this new agreement would have meant that the US would have had to go back to ratify this treaty from Congress, and we kind of know where that would have gone. So we didn't, nations were very conscious of trying to bring the two big players into this, which is the United States and China. So I'll talk more about that in a second. So just a quick, really short story about a very long process. So in 1992, when, as Nainoa Thompson mentioned, his friend Lacey Veach was telling Hokulea that they should be doing a worldwide voyage, leaders met in Rio and signed the UNFCCC. So this is a process that goes back some years. And it's surprising when you say, oh, this started in 1992, and only now in 2015 they have come to agree that all nations must do something. So this is just the time scale that we're dealing with when you deal with 196 parties and human beings. So that's when that was signed, and it was just a very broad agreement to do something. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was signed, and that was really developed countries cutting back on emissions, or pledging to cut back on emissions. The US, as we know, did not sign that, and at the time China was not part of this. So really the two big emitters now were not included in this Kyoto Protocol, so you can see why that was unsatisfactory. And so then in 2009, they had, so these are all COPs that are happening every year, but I'm just pulling out some of the key ones. COP15, Copenhagen, was sort of people might have heard, it was sort of a disaster. That was the year that Obama had come into office. He actually went into COP15 to try and save it. And they had a big old bust-up, a bureaucratic bust-up about it, and political leaders had to sort of come in and, quote, save the day, which wasn't really saved. And then in 2000, they decided after that in 2011 they were going to launch this process, so that at the end of it, and the process was called the Durban Platform. There's a longer name for it, but we don't need to go into it here. And at the end of that process in 2015, they said that there would be a new agreement, and that was the COP21. And that's where the Paris Agreement really was born. It was born from that 2011 process. Now, it doesn't actually enter into force until 2020. So Right now, what's going to happen is in April this year on Earth Day, it will be open for signing. So, I'm sorry, open for ratification. And what will happen is that all these countries will go back to their governments and go through their domestic ratification processes, and then they will come back and deposit this at the UN in some big ceremony. And it will be open for about a year, and then after that, they'll allow countries to come into the club. But essentially, if it's 55 countries accounting for at least 55% of global greenhouse gas emissions, so 55 and 55, so once that happens, then it will enter into force, and that's when the pledges will sort of come into play. Okay, so why was Paris a big deal, and how was this different from other processes? Just really briefly, it was an interesting time to be there because I think there was a real sense for let's make this work. This is a family of nations. It's peace at work. And this is something that, especially after the terror attacks in Paris, this had happened just a couple of weeks before the COP21. And I think there was a real sense to let's show the world that we can actually come together on this issue. So that helped. But it was different. It is different because the Kyoto Protocol really only covered about 14% of current global emissions. So keep in mind that China and the US were not part of that coverage, and nobody dreamed that back in 1997 that China would be growing at such a phenomenal rate for the next 20 years. And so, and with that growth would come emissions growth as well. So, so really it was different because now they've got countries who are pledging, and all countries are pledging, not just the developed countries. And it was different from the Copenhagen, the COP15 process because they realized it wasn't going to work that way, and without getting into too much technical detail, really that Durban platform which was launched was very transparent. It was so transparent, I would say, that even, and this is very encouraging for someone who's been watching this process since 1992, that we've been hankering for transparency as a civil society, and this really, sometimes the draft documents that would come out, they would come out at the same time, and parties to the convention would see it at the same time as we, the independent observers, were seeing this. And this is really, you know, things have moved. I mean, they're moving slowly, but they are moving. So I would say this was really a pleasure to see. And so it was very different. So on the topic of pledges, I just wanted to go quickly into, just to remind folks, you know, just go very quickly through this. The Carbon Club, what I call the big four emitters, are China, the US, the EU, and India, and it's in that order. And the budget really for us to keep that 2-degree warming, to keep us below 2-degree warming, is about 100 billion tons cumulative. That means from now until eternity. That's how much carbon we can put into the atmosphere. Currently, we are expending about 45 billion tons. That's a 2012 number, so you can imagine we've already gone below that 900 billion. Okay, so on the topic of pledges, so what did the US, China, the EU, and India pledge? They're all different numbers, and they look kind of complicated, but I'm going to put them up there just because I just wanted to say that the basic thing is that the US says, let's cut emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025. So that's straight out cuts, okay? And China says, okay, we are going to reduce energy intensity 60 to 65% by 2030. So that's not out and out cuts. And they're basically saying we are growing until 2030. We are going to keep growing. We'll make it more efficient, but we'll keep growing. And then it's anyone's guess as to what they're really saying. Are they saying they will peak? Are they saying they will stabilize at that high growth? So those are the two. We're still not seeing equivalent cuts, okay? The EU has got something equivalent to the United States. It's 40% over 1990 levels. So again, you're looking at out and out cuts. For India, India is not to be left behind. So like, hey, we're going to come in here too, and we're also going to do what China's done, which is we'll also say we're going to do intensity cuts. Okay, so this is still not equal, but it's still, the nations are coming together. This is for the first time they're sitting together at the table and saying we will do something. So the carbon pie, as you want to, if you want to call it that, is basically, if you look at it, China emits a quarter of the world's emissions. The US 14% and the EU 10%. So you look at basically China emits the same as the US and the EU put together. And in that little purple slice is India at 7%, and the rest of the world has got 45. Okay. These are all 2012 numbers. Okay, so you might then say, okay, what was the Paris Agreement worth? Is it going to do anything for us? It's this big aspirational agreement, and what's the point of it all? So we're essentially, other scholars have done this work too, and I'm also working on this, but essentially, what was Paris worth? It has bought us a little bit of time, okay? How much time, we don't know. We're thinking it's about maybe 5, 6, 7 years, but don't quote me on it yet. I'm still working on the models. So it buys us a little time before we have to completely decarbonize. So folks, we're not talking about just cutting back on emissions. We're really talking about moving the whole paradigm to a decarbonized economy, a decarbonized world. So, and that needs to happen soon. With the pledges we've got, that's not going to happen, unless we completely decarbonize. And so I don't know. I guess I shouldn't say that again. But that's the same. That's what we've found. So it buys us a little time. It has brought countries like the U.S. and China to the table, and it establishes some kind of a baseline for funding. Okay. So I was looking at the funding numbers, and the Green Climate Fund is $100 billion every year starting in 2020. So what's been pledged so far, and it's about between 10 and 12 billion that's been pledged so far. So they're saying every year 100 billion will go towards some kind of climate, towards this thing that we're calling a high priority, right? Okay, so to put it in context, I thought, well, that's a lot of money, right? Okay, so let me see how it compares to these two things. And I'm sorry if I'm making you hungry for lunch. I realize I'm standing between you and lunch right now. But in 2013, Americans alone spent $83 billion on beer. Probably much of that last Sunday. But that was and on potato chips, 7 billion. So together, those are about 90 billion in 2013 alone for the United States alone, okay? Now, these are, of course, different sources of funding, but that's just how it compares, okay? And so, I just wanted to say that if this is a priority, then nations must treat it like one. And that means that pledges have to be kept to, the pledges that the countries have put up there, and that the role of civil society and the media is to hold nations to their promises, okay? To be those watchdogs and to demand more ambition from these countries, from our governments, from our subnational governments, and so that we have more than just potato chips and beer for green climate funding. And I will just, just close with the messages from that we've heard earlier of Kokua and coming together and so on. And I will say that economist Jeffrey Sachs, who is at Columbia University, also echoes these sentiments, and he says, the diplomats have done their job. The Paris Agreement points the world in the right direction and with sophistication and clarity. It does not, however, ensure implementation, which necessarily remains the domain of politicians, businessmen, scientists, engineers, and civil society. And that's all of us. Mahalo ya oku.